Hello, it's Saturday, May 14th, 2022. In the late afternoon or the evening, I just finished a Spanish reading and discussion circle of looking at Borges' Klein Utbar Orbis Tertius, and right before that had a Great Books of Western Civilization reading and discussion seminar where we looked at Herodotus's book one of his histories, and that concludes the second week of my academy, and I'm extremely fulfilled and happy with the way it's going. I hope the participants feel the same way and are planning on continuing into June when we have circles of people that we know we're going to stay together for a couple of months. We can move on and look at longer works, read novels and the like. Speaking of reading novels, that's sort of my theme of this evening. In this comfortable chair is where I sit to read novels, and I read both with my eyes and with my ears, not simultaneously, but that is to say, there are times when I sit here and I read a book like this. And there are times when I sit here and I read a book like this. Listening to an audiobook, listening to an audio novel. And I would like to talk today about realization that I've had about looking at my own life and the way that I evolved and developed the ability to do that, and sort of steps that came along the way that led me to do this in a way that I now consider to be wrong, or at least not as efficient as what I now know to be the case. So the subject of listening to materials comes up very often, and many people write, you can beg, buy, borrow, or steal more time to do listening more easily than you can to do other activities. It is very easy and sometimes productive to combine listening with, say, doing housework or exercising, and these are things that you can't. It's invaluable to do that. And in the stages of language learning, when you are, as you're going for a run, if you are listening to the same didactic material that you have been shadowing from a textbook and you're reviewing it by doing it this way, that's very efficient. Likewise, if you're doing dishes or something else around the house, and maybe you even moved on a little bit and are now listening to some sort of short thing like a podcast, you can easily do that while you are otherwise engaged. But the thing that I said that I feel that I maybe did wrong with audiobooks, longer books, novels, or works of nonfiction also, but just longer connected narratives. If you graduate to listening to connected narratives, and I think you're more likely to do that in a foreign language where you've gone through the didactic process and listening to some easier materials, it's easy to do it in the same way. And I think that audiobook companies, in a way, in a certain sense, kind of push you to do that. Listen while you're on the move, listen while you're driving, listen while you're doing things like this. And I don't think that that's necessarily wrong or bad, but in terms of efficiency, getting the most out of the connected book, the connected narrative, and also in getting the most out of your language learning, your language use time, I don't think it's ideal, and I've come to realize that belatedly. And so, again, it's always the purpose of my channel. If I can sort of share my experience and get you to do the more efficient way sooner than I did, then my life has been well spent if I save you time. So, reading. Referring back to my video I made a couple of weeks ago, the whole concept of extensive reading. I watched that again myself, and I wish I had stressed more than I did the fact that extensive reading, I feel, has gotten changed. The meaning of it has gotten changed as it's become more popularized and put into education, and as graded readers and things have been made for it. There's nothing wrong with any of that, but the original idea of extensive reading is just like when you're growing up, when you're 12 years old, if you read books that are designed for 13-year-olds or so, you're just challenging yourself a bit more, and you're interested in it. It's fun, you're going to go on. Extensive reading was always planned around being extensive, meaning not just lots of, reading a lot of this, a lot of that, spending a lot of time doing it, but it was to be pleasure reading. So it was more to be a novel than a a work of nonfiction, but it was meant to be a connected, longer work by a single author. And there's a real reason for that, and that is that in terms of vocabulary range, the 3,000 or 5,000 most common words are used by everybody, but when you go into the 10, 15, 20,000 most frequent word range, all educated native speakers might have about 20,000, but they don't necessarily have the same 20,000, and they certainly don't have the same, when you're even in the 12 or 10,000 range, have the same active vocabulary. So I have words that I'm fond of and I use a lot, and you might know them, but you might not use them. You have other words that you use a lot that I know but don't use. And so the whole concept of extensive reading, where you just pick up the meaning of the word by seeing it in context, you really do need to stick with one author in a lengthy text to see those words occur with the most frequency. If you're switching authors all the time, if you're reading shorter texts, it'll work too, but it'll just take longer. So for maximum efficiency, you want to stick with one author for a long time. Ideally, you read several works by this same author. Also, the whole concept of reading shorter things or short stories or things like this, again, there's nothing bad or wrong with that, but in terms of really challenging your mind to have that linguistic development and get maturity of understanding and use of vocabulary and of language, to have a connected narrative and to keep that thread that ties a story together over several hundred pages is a challenge in and of itself. And so that's another thing that you only get if you, say, read a novel by doing extensive reading. So today I'm talking about listening. There is a concept of extensive listening out there, but it somehow never got quite as much currency, and it's not quite the same. And so when I'm talking about using audio books, audio novels for polyliteracy, I am kind of talking about the same thing. And it goes back to that connective thread one more time. I guess what I have to say about the most effective way to read audiobooks in foreign languages probably really does apply to reading audio books in English. I don't pick up a book and just go for a run reading a book, whether it's in English or any other things. I mean, certainly while I'm driving, you need to concentrate. You're going to, put something there. So reading should demand an amount of concentration. Reading should demand an amount of focus, whether it's with your eyes or with your ears. And if you graduate into listening to longer works, listen to audiobooks from listening to didactic materials, you're likely to skip over this step. I did. For many years, I would go for a run and listen to novels, and I would do things like this. And again, it's not bad, it's not wrong, but I think ultimately, how can I put this? If I listen for an hour, but I'm not focused, I'm not paying attention in terms of getting like quality language development, language use, language understanding, I might just be giving myself 15 or 20 minutes instead of a full 60 minutes. So I think that in order to best read audiobooks, particularly in a foreign language, it does behoove you to sit in a set place the same way you would if you were to read a text here, and to focus in a similar manner, and not imagine that you can wander around or do exercise or other things while you're listening to a connected text. So the aspects of a foreign language connected text versus a, say, native language English text and extensive reading, I think that both extensive reading and extensive listening, I would definitely want to have both. I'm not going to, at my stage of being more advanced, I don't want to both listen to and read the same thing, but I would like to do both activities. I would like to have both ways of reading. When you've got the text, that nothing beats actually seeing the new word and seeing the beautiful phrasing and being able to flip back and look at the references and all of this kind of thing. Whereas when you're listening, nothing beats hearing the language, being able to shadow the language and having it come alive. Speaking of coming alive, we mentioned that it has been basically established that in order to do extensive reading with a text, you need to have about 98% vocabulary coverage. You can not know one word out of every 50. If you have 97% coverage, that means you don't know one word out of every 33, or 96% coverage, you don't know one word out of every 25. as you're reading, you will feel like you're understanding and following the story, but you're going to lose that connective thread and you're going to get confused. I think with listening to audiobooks, audio novels, it really, another factor enters into it, apart from the author and the text, and that is the narrator. And I think that a bad narrator, God forbid, a computerized voice narrator, I think with that, if it's possible to listen at all, maybe you need 99% coverage. I mean, if you don't have any intonation helping you along. But ideally, the whole world of audio books, audio novels has expanded so much in my lifetime. When I was young, audiobooks were really hard to find. They were for blind people. They weren't out there for common consumption. And now there's Audible and all these other wonderful things where you get thousands and thousands of books in all these different languages and many different narrators that you can choose from. And if you can find and choose a talented narrator, then I believe that one advantage of audio novel listening is because the narrator carries so much emphasis in his or her voice, I think that you can probably follow a narrative with 97 or 96 or maybe even 95% coverage, whereas you would need at 98% just with your own voice providing the meaning while you're listening if you're reading the text. So that is a good advantage of audiobook listening, apart from being able to hear and shadow it as you go along. But like I said, I think that if you just walk around with it and think you're going to listen to it and do it all the time the same way you would a narrative text, you're not going to get as much out of it. So what is the best way to get the most out of listening to an audiobook? Again, principally in a foreign language, but I think probably just as well, truly, in your own language. And that is, you need some more advanced technology. You might want to have this really sophisticated thing called a pad, or something like a pencil. Here's a mechanical pencil. Or you might even want to get more sophisticated and get some sort of notebook and a pen. And you want to, as you listen, you want to realize, okay, I'm engaged now in listening to a protected text that I can't look at. And it is in a foreign language where, even if I do have 98% coverage and I'm thinking that's easy because now I can do extensive reading, again, go do some of the research. 98% coverage in your native language is considered hard. In your native language, an easy text is where you know 100% basically of the words. So in a foreign language with different cultural contexts, if you're lucky having 98% things, you're still going to be challenged for a long, long time in keeping that narrative thread, which is the fascinating intellectual challenge of listening to a longer work. So, as I was saying, you want to ideally have some form of this high technology here as you're listening. I'm listening along. And I am going to, as I go along, I'm going to want to say, okay, what the name of the main character? Write it down. The name of somebody who comes back. Okay, write it down. Some of the details that you would be able to check so easily in flipping through a text that you aren't able to check here are things that you want to jot down as you go along. Then I would also say that a best way to use an audiobook and get the most out of the story and also the most out of your language development is to not have it be pure listening. A, shadow as you go along. Why not, as you listen to part of it? But B, I would definitely say that in order to keep that thread and not fool yourself into thinking that you have it when you don't, you need to use the most basic forms of the narrative structure that have been put into any literary creation, such as a novel. That is the chapter. Listen at a chapter at a time. Listen to one chapter, and when you're done with a chapter, stop listening and maybe refer to your notes and maybe write out a little bit more. Say exactly what I do in my reading and discussion circles. I have the people read aloud and then say in their own words what they have said. You need to do that yourself to make sure that you're following the thread. It's so easy to say, I understand it. Oh, yeah, I get it. But then if you try to say what happened in that chapter and you can't do it, if you tell yourself, oh, I know it, I just can't say it, you're fooling yourself. And you're going to eventually lose the thread and you're not going to get very much out of it. So after each chapter, stop and say aloud, summarize the chapter, and make sure that you can do that. I think it might be good to take some scattered notes on a little pad like this, but also, particularly after you've done the chapter, after you've done a couple of reading for the thing, then just in short summary form, write it down in a more permanent form, say with a pen and a little notebook, so that you can refer back to it, pick up where you stopped if you interrupt your reading. And you might want to interrupt your reading for numerous reasons. The main one being, on my channel here, we're talking about polyliteracy, meaning multiple languages, multiple books, multiple reading. And that's why I gave this clip the title that I did, How to Read Books in Foreign Languages, audiobooks in foreign languages. Because if you want to be a polyglot, if you want to be polyliterate, it means you need multiple languages. And people often ask, how do you learn so many languages? Well, learning is easy. Learning is the easy part. Learning is a transferable skill and a learnable skill. So the first couple of languages you learn are hard, but it gets easier and easier, and then it's just a question of putting in the time. Learning lots of languages isn't terribly challenging. What is very challenging is saying, okay, now what? How do I use all the languages that I know? How do I take the languages that I know and develop them to a higher level? When I say learn a language, go through a couple of textbooks, get to some functional level, that's relatively easy. But to go from that functional level to a higher level, to a deeper understanding, to a sophisticated knowledge, each of those steps requires more time and more investment. And so there's only so many languages that you can take up to that higher level and balance, and then trying to keep them all is a real balancing and juggling act that I'm continuously inventing new ways of trying to do it without falling down myself. But I think that ultimately, if you want to be polyliterate, you need to read for, I would say, at least 3 hours a day. 3 hours a day might sound like a lot if you're thinking of sitting down and going through textbooks, but if you have been a bookworm your whole life, if you're a reader, if reading is your form of edification, self-edification, education, enjoyment, then reading for a couple of hours a day should be a norm for you. And when you can start to read, not in your own language, but as I said in my video about developing reading skills, developing the ability to read in other languages with the same facility with which you read in your language, then it is a reward and a payback more than a chore. But you do need to put that time in order to do that. So I think that in order to be polyliterate or a polyglot, you probably need to read for about 3 hours a day. So the question is, how are you going to divide that 3 hours between, say, 3 languages? If you got 3 languages, you could read an audiobook for an hour a day in each of 3 languages. There's nothing wrong with that. It might work, but that implies really taking a long time to finish any one, and also balancing simultaneous narratives when you're developing sort of a plot story. So if you're reading novels and you've got different people going on, my father does that. My father has no problem keeping multiple narratives, reading a little bit in each one. So this suits some people, some polyglots very much. I've found where I am, my balancing act, that let's say I'm working on really developing, reading good quality literature, reading novels in 3 languages. I'm trying to balance them and keep them going at the same time. I've used an analogy recently a lot of making sort of Ptolemaic-like orbits and ellipticals. And I think it's better to do this in something like that. So I've got language A, B, and C. I could read an hour a day in each every day, but I think it's preferable to look and say, well, your average novel, your average audiobook is about 9 or 10 hours long. You have some that are 5 or 6 hours long. You have some that are 15 hours long. You have some that are 30 hours long. You've got novellas that are 3 hours long. But your average audio book is probably about 9 or 10 hours long. So you should be able to read one with your ears in about 3 days. So if you've got 3 languages, you've got 3 hours a day to read, and you can read a book, an audiobook, in 3 days, then you can put it on a kind of cycle where you read language A for 3 days, you read language B for 3 days, you read language C for 3 days. So in a given week, you're going to read one language, you're going to read at least one language for 3 days. You might read 2 languages for 2 days each. You might read 2 languages for 3 days and one language for 1 day. The week is kind of an artificial concept. You're going to keep this rolling and cycling in this fashion. And in that way, you can both immerse yourself in a story, you can finish a story, a novel, and you can come back to another novel, ideally by that same author or something similar, in a reasonable time frame. So that has currently proving to be a more satisfactory way of trying to balance various languages rather than trying to get to them all each day. But again, I have only really started to enjoy and profit from listening with my ears when I give the text that I'm listening to the same amount of attention that I've always given it to when I listen to it, like when I read it like this, rather than taking for granted, because I've developed the habit of listening from my learning phase, listening to didactic materials. So please just remember those few very basic steps when you listen to an audio novel, an audiobook, okay? You should do it with the same attention that you would while you're actually reading the text, not while you're on a stationary bike or something, but while you're in a comfortable chair with a comfortable cat on your lap. The cat is essential. Get a cat. Then you want to jot down notes of main ideas, main words, main things as you see. You want to finish a chapter and make sure you can say it aloud, and maybe once you've said it aloud, maybe you want to write it down so you remember. Because what could happen is, as we said, if you got yourself on the cycle of 3 days of language A, 3 days of language B, 3 days of language C, this is an interesting challenge. What if you come to, we said that your average book is 9 or 10 hours, but you're definitely going to read books that are 12 or 15 or 20 hours. That means you're going to need to break that into a cycle. So you could have it be a longer cycle, but also if you have the names of all the main characters, all the main actions, a summary of each chapter written down in a form like this, then 6 days later, you can come back to it, you can revise what you've written down, and you can pick up where you've left off with no great strain. And you can look forward to coming back to it rather than regretting breaking it off. So those are some of my thoughts on the most productive way to listen to audio novels in particular in foreign languages when you're at a high enough level to start really enjoying them the same way you would enjoy listening to a talented narrator tell a great story in your own language. I hope that was useful and helpful for you, and I will talk to you again next week. Thank you.